The betrayal that unfolded in Norway's frozen halls was far more horrifying than you imagine. When you think of medieval treachery, you probably picture poisoned cups or daggers in the dark. But what happened at Sverisborg in November 1164 would redefine the very meaning of betrayal, transforming a sacred feast into a slaughterhouse that would haunt Norwegian memory for centuries. The story you're about to hear isn't just about political murder. It's about how the bonds of kinship and sacred hospitality could be perverted into instruments of unspeakable cruelty. The year was 1164, and Trondheim's streets echoed with the sounds of preparation for winter, merchants hawking preserved fish and thick furs, while children gathered firewood for the long, dark months ahead. But on this November evening, a different sound would soon fill the air. The screams of men who had come as guests only to die like animals in a carefully orchestrated massacre. What transpired that night was not merely an assassination, but a complete violation of every law, both human and divine, that governed medieval society. The popular imagination has reduced this event to a footnote in Norwegian history, a simple power struggle between rival claimants. But the reality was far more sinister, involving psychological manipulation, religious desecration, and a level of premeditated cruelty that shocked even the violence-hardened Norse. If this dark tale of betrayal captivates you, consider subscribing to hear more forgotten horrors from history's shadows. Before the blood soaked the wooden floors of Sverisborg's Great Hall, Erling stood as the most powerful man in Norway, the kingmaker who had placed his own son, Magnus Erlingsson, on the throne when the boy was merely 5 years old. Erling was no ordinary nobleman. He was a veteran of the Crusades, a man who had walked the streets of Jerusalem and fought alongside the greatest warriors of Christendom. His shoulders bore the scars of countless battles, his hands had wielded swords blessed by bishops, and his reputation as a military genius was matched only by his political cunning. Contemporary accounts describe him as a man of imposing physical presence, standing nearly 6 feet tall, in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, with arms thick as tree trunks from years of wielding heavy weapons. He had earned the nickname Skaker, meaning crooked neck, from an old battle wound that left his head permanently tilted, giving him an unsettling appearance that made even brave men uncomfortable in his presence. Yet beneath this warrior exterior lurked a mind capable of extraordinary calculation. Erling had not simply seized power through force, he had carefully constructed a new model of Norwegian kingship, using his son as a vessel for his ambitions. Young Magnus had been crowned by Archbishop Eystein in Bergen, the first Norwegian king to receive such ecclesiastical legitimation, transforming what many saw as usurpation into divine mandate. This religious sanction was Erling's masterpiece, turning his opponents from mere political rivals into enemies of God himself. The irony was exquisite and terrible. The man who would orchestrate one of history's most sacrilegious betrayals had wrapped himself in the cloak of Christian authority, using the church as a weapon against those who challenged his family's claim to power. The tragedy's roots stretched back to the death of King Sigurd the Crusader in 1130, which had plunged Norway into an era of civil wars that historians would later call the Age of Warring Princes. For over 30 years, the kingdom had been torn apart as different branches of the royal family fought for supremacy, each claiming descent from Harald Fairhair, the legendary first king of unified Norway. Into this chaos had emerged a new threat to Erling's carefully constructed power, the Birkebeiner, a rebel faction named for the birch bark leggings they wore in place of proper boots, marking them as men too poor to afford real military equipment. Their leader, Marcus, claimed to be fighting for the rights of King Sigurd Mund's descendants, but more importantly, he represented all those who had been marginalized by Erling's new order. The Birkebeiner were not merely political opponents, They were a social revolution in motion. These were men from the forests and mountains, hunters and small farmers who had watched as Erling consolidated power among the coastal aristocracy and the church. They fought with the desperation of those who had nothing to lose, using guerrilla tactics learned from generations of surviving in Norway's harsh interior. Marcus himself was a fascinating figure, described in the sagas as possessing an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty, a man who could make hardened warriors weep with his speeches about justice and ancient honor. His very existence was an affront to everything Erling had built, a reminder that not all Norwegians accepted the new Christian kingship that had been imposed upon them. By the autumn of 1164, the conflict had reached a dangerous stalemate. Erling controlled the major towns and had the backing of the church, but the Birkebeiner dominated the rural areas and were growing stronger with each passing season. Winter was approaching, and both sides knew that the harsh Norwegian weather would soon make large-scale military operations impossible. It was then that Erling conceived his monstrous solution. He would invite the Birkebeiner leaders to Sverisborg under the pretense of negotiating a peace treaty, offering them safe conduct guaranteed by sacred oaths sworn on holy relics. The feast would be held on St. Cecilia's Eve, a holy day when violence was particularly forbidden, adding another layer of religious protection to his guests. The invitation itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Erling knew that refusing such an offer would make the Birkebeiner appear as the aggressors, unwilling to consider peace. But accepting meant placing themselves entirely in his power, trusting in oaths that Erling had already decided to break. The letters of invitation, some of which survived in monastery archives before mysteriously disappearing during the Reformation, reportedly contained elaborate promises of reconciliation and even hints at power-sharing arrangements. Marcus and his lieutenants debated for days, understanding the danger but also recognizing the opportunity. Winter quarters were always difficult for rebel forces, and the promise of a negotiated settlement could save countless lives. In the end, hope triumphed over suspicion, though several Birkebeiner leaders reportedly experienced disturbing dreams in the nights before their departure, visions of ravens feasting on human flesh that Norse tradition would have recognized as omens of impending doom. As November 21st approached, Sverisborg was transformed into what appeared to be a venue for grand diplomacy. The Great Hall was decorated with the finest tapestries, showing scenes from biblical stories and the lives of saints, a bitter irony considering what was planned. Erling had ordered 3 times the normal amount of food prepared, including rare delicacies like peacock and wine imported from France, creating an atmosphere of exceptional generosity. The serving staff had been carefully selected, all of them proven loyal to Erling, and many were actually soldiers disguised in servants' clothing. Hidden throughout the building were weapons, swords concealed behind tapestries, axes tucked under benches, and crossbows positioned in the gallery above the main hall. The entire fortress had become an elaborate trap, baited with hospitality and blessed by the church. The Birkebeiner delegation arrived as the sun was setting, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air as they climbed the hill to Sverisborg. They numbered about 60 men, including Marcus and his closest advisors, all of them seasoned warriors who had survived years of civil war. Yet they came peacefully, their weapons surrendered at the gate as custom demanded of guests, trusting in the ancient laws of hospitality that even enemies were supposed to respect. Witnesses later reported that Marcus seemed unusually subdued, his characteristic eloquence replaced by watchful silence as he entered the hall. Some claimed he whispered to his closest companion that the decorations reminded him of a funeral shroud, though he proceeded with the diplomatic ritual nonetheless. The feast began with elaborate ceremony. Archbishop Eystein himself blessed the meal, invoking God's presence to sanctify the peace negotiations that were to follow. Erling rose to give a welcoming speech, praising the courage of his guests and speaking of a new Norway where former enemies could become brothers in Christ. The wine flowed freely, special vintages that Erling claimed to have saved for just such an occasion of reconciliation. Musicians played, including a famous skald who improvised verses about peace overcoming war, though those who understood the complex metaphors of Norse poetry later claimed his words contained hidden warnings that went unheeded in the festive atmosphere. As the evening progressed, the Birkebeiner began to relax. The warmth of the hall, the rich food and the strong wine all worked to lower their guard. Erling proved a masterful host, moving among his guests with apparent genuine warmth, sharing war stories and even laughing at jokes made at his own expense. Young Magnus, the boy king, was brought out to meet the rebels, his innocent presence seeming to guarantee that no violence could occur in front of a child, especially one who wore the holy crown of Norway. Several Birkebeiner were heard commenting that perhaps they had misjudged Erling, that a man capable of such hospitality might indeed be someone with whom they could work. It was near midnight when the transformation began. The musicians suddenly stopped playing, and in the silence that followed, the great doors of the hall slammed shut with a sound like thunder. Erling stood slowly, and his earlier warmth vanished like frost in flame. "You came here as rebels," he announced, his crooked neck giving his proclamation an even more sinister aspect, "and rebels you shall die." The hidden soldiers emerged from their disguises, weapons appearing as if from nowhere. The gallery above filled with crossbowmen, their bolts already aimed at the stunned guests below. What followed was not battle, but butchery, made more horrifying by its calculated efficiency. The killing began with Marcus himself. As the Birkebeiner leader rose from his seat, whether to speak or fight will never be known, 3 crossbow bolts struck him simultaneously, one in the throat, silencing his famous voice forever, another in his chest, and a third in his belly. He fell forward onto the feast table, his blood mixing with the spilled wine in a grotesque parody of the Holy Communion that had blessed the meal hours before. His death seemed to trigger a frenzy among Erling's men, who fell upon the unarmed Birkebeiner with a savagery that shocked even medieval sensibilities. The trapped rebels fought with whatever they could find, chairs, candlesticks, even plates, but they were overwhelmed by armed soldiers who had planned every detail of the massacre. The slaughter took on an almost ritualistic quality as Erling's men seemed to compete in their brutality. One young Birkebeiner, barely more than a boy, was forced to watch as his father and uncles were methodically executed before him, only to be blinded and then thrown from the fortress walls while still alive. Another rebel, known for his beautiful singing voice, had his tongue cut out before being strangled with a harp string. The archbishop, who historical accounts suggest remained present throughout the massacre, reportedly continued to pray loudly, though whether he was blessing the killers or praying for the souls of the dying remains a matter of heated historical debate. Some witnesses claimed his prayers grew louder with each scream, as if trying to drown out the sounds of slaughter with sacred words. The hall itself became a vision of hell. Blood pooled on the floor so deep that men slipped in it as they tried to flee or fight. The beautiful tapestries were splattered with gore, their religious scenes now backdrop to real martyrdom. The feast table, which hours before had groaned under the weight of delicacies, was overturned in the struggle, mixing food with flesh in a nauseating display. Some Birkebeiner tried to surrender, falling to their knees and begging for mercy, invoking the same oaths of safe conduct that had brought them there. Erling personally executed several of these men, reportedly saying that oaths sworn to traitors were void in the eyes of God, though how he reconciled this with his own betrayal was never explained. The most horrifying aspect was the systematic nature of the violence. This was not a spontaneous outbreak of bloodshed, but a carefully planned extermination. Erling's men had lists of names, ensuring that no important Birkebeiner escaped. They moved through the hall methodically, checking bodies to ensure death, slitting throats of any who still breathed. The few servants who were not part of the plot were forced to watch, Erling declaring that they would serve as witnesses to what happened to those who challenged his son's crown. Unserving girl, driven mad by what she witnessed, later claimed that she saw the devil himself, standing behind Erling's shoulder, whispering instructions, though her testimony was dismissed as hysteria. When dawn finally broke over Sverisborg, the great hall resembled a slaughterhouse more than a place of noble gathering. 60 men lay dead, their bodies bearing wounds that spoke not just of killing, but of deliberate mutilation. Erling ordered the corpses displayed on the fortress walls, a warning to any who might consider joining the Birkebeiner cause. The heads of the leaders, including Marcus, were preserved in salt and sent to various towns throughout Norway, carried by heralds who proclaimed that this was the fate of all who opposed God's anointed king. The message was clear. The old rules of warfare, the ancient codes of honor that had governed Norse society for centuries, no longer applied in Erling's new order. Yet something strange happened in the aftermath of the massacre, something that contemporary chronicles mention but never fully explain. Several of Erling's own men, hardened warriors who had fought in numerous battles, reportedly could not sleep after that night. They claimed to hear the voices of the dead echoing through Sverisborg's halls, particularly the sound of Marcus trying to speak through his ruined throat. 3 of the soldiers who had participated most enthusiastically in the killing were found dead within a month, apparently having taken their own lives, though the official records attributed their deaths to various accidents. The serving staff reported that the bloodstains in the Great Hall would not wash clean, no matter how much they scrubbed, and eventually Erling ordered the entire floor replaced, though workers claimed the new wood began to show the same dark stains within days. The Archbishop's role in the massacre became a source of intense controversy within the church itself. Letters preserved in the Vatican archives, though their authenticity has been questioned, suggest that Pope Alexander III was horrified when news of the feast reached Rome. The idea that a consecrated archbishop had blessed and witnessed such a violation of sanctuary and hospitality struck at the very heart of Christian law. Yet Eystein not only escaped punishment, but continued to serve as archbishop, leading some historians to speculate that he possessed some leverage over the papal court, possibly knowledge of other scandals that the church wished to keep hidden. His own writings from this period, preserved in fragments, speak of necessary evils and divine justice, but also contain passages of such anguished self-reflection that they suggest a man tormented by his role in the atrocity. Erling himself showed no such torment, at least not publicly. He consolidated his power ruthlessly in the massacre's aftermath, using the fear generated by the Feast of Blood to crush remaining resistance. Yet accounts from those close to him suggest that he was changed by that night, becoming increasingly paranoid and unable to eat meat, claiming it reminded him of something he would not specify. He began construction of numerous churches, ostensibly to honor God and his son's reign, but servants whispered that he could be heard within them at strange hours, not praying but arguing with someone only he could see. His relationship with his son Magnus also deteriorated, the boy king growing increasingly distant from his father as he matured and began to understand the full horror of how his crown had been secured. The Birkebeiner, rather than being destroyed by the massacre, were transformed by it. The survivors rallied around a new leader, Sverre Sigurdsson, who would eventually overthrow Magnus and establish a new dynasty. Sverre used the memory of Sverisborg as a rallying cry, transforming the Feast of Blood into a legend of martyrdom that would inspire resistance for generations. He claimed that Marcus had appeared to him in a vision, his throat miraculously healed, prophesying that Erling's line would fail and that those who had died at the feast would be avenged. Whether divine vision or clever propaganda, the story proved powerful enough to help topple Erling's carefully constructed kingdom. Modern historians examining the events at Sverisborg have noticed curious gaps in the historical record. Several contemporary accounts of the massacre were supposedly written but have never been found, including a detailed chronicle by a monk who claimed to have hidden in the hall during the killing. The official records from Erling's reign show signs of alteration, with dates and details that don't match other sources. Most intriguingly, archaeological excavations at the site have revealed anomalies, burn marks that don't match any recorded fire, and beneath the hall's foundation, much older bones arranged in patterns that suggest pre-Christian ritual practices. Could the massacre have awakened something ancient in that place? Or was Erling deliberately choosing a site already tainted by earlier atrocities? The Feast of Blood at Sverisborg stands as one of history's most complete betrayals, violating every principle that held medieval society together. Guest right, sacred oaths, religious sanctuary, and the bonds of shared humanity, all were shattered in a single night of calculated horror. The event marked a turning point not just in Norwegian history, but in the evolution of political violence itself, demonstrating that when power is pursued without moral constraint, it creates wounds that never fully heal. The blood spilled that November night would echo through centuries of Norwegian memory, a reminder that civilization's veneer can be stripped away by those who believe their cause justifies any means. The true horror of Sverisborg lies not in its violence alone. Medieval Europe knew many massacres, but in its perversion of everything deemed sacred. Erling had not simply killed his enemies, he had used the very instruments of peace and fellowship as weapons of destruction. The feast, the church's blessing, the promise of reconciliation, all had been transformed into tools of murder. This corruption of the sacred proved so disturbing that even in an age accustomed to brutality, the Feast of Blood stood apart as something uniquely evil, a moment when the boundaries between civilization and savagery didn't just blur, but completely dissolved. Today, as we look back at the frozen halls of Sverisborg, we might ask ourselves what drove Erling to such extremes. Was he simply a power-hungry tyrant? Or was there something more complex at work? The missing chronicles, the altered records, the persistent legends of supernatural occurrences all suggest layers to this story that conventional history has chosen to ignore or suppress. Perhaps most unsettling is the question of the Archbishop's involvement. What hold did Erling have over the church that could make a man of God participate in such sacrilege? Or did Eystein know something about that night, about that place, that made him believe the massacre was not just politically expedient, but somehow necessary? The Feast of Blood remains one of history's darkest mysteries, its true nature hidden beneath layers of official narrative and lost testimony. Were they merely executing rebels that night at Sverisborg? Or were they trying to prevent something even more terrible from emerging? The blood has long since been washed away, but the questions remain, echoing through time like the voices of the dead that Erling's soldiers claimed to hear. The story reminds us that in the pursuit of power, humans are capable of betrayals that transcend ordinary evil, creating horrors that haunt not just memory, but the very places where they occurred. In the end, we're left wondering, was the Feast of Blood simply medieval brutality at its worst, or was it something more? A glimpse into darkness that those who witnessed it could never fully describe or forget. If you found this journey into history's shadows compelling, subscribe to uncover more forgotten horrors that shaped our world.